Oh, hey, I'm just waiting for my uncle to get back. He said he had to go to the castle or something. I don't know, he just told me to wait here. It's been 3 days. You know what? I'm tired of waiting. If he isn't gonna pop up, I might as well open this mysterious box right next to me. He told me to wait until he got back, but I can't wait any longer. Oh boy, I hope it's something overrated and underwhelming. Last time we took a look at the start of the Legend of Zelda series, where Nintendo experimented with two different types of games. One being a top-down open adventure game that focused more on exploration, while the other was a side-scroller that focused more on combat than anything else. Both were nice additions to the NES library, but the series could still use some improvement. As fun as they were, the biggest turnoff for players is that they could easily get lost and couldn't figure out what to do next because the games were cryptic as hell. Not only that, but at times the games could be unforgiving and restart a good bit of progress if you eventually met up with your untimely demise. So yeah, the series was far from perfect, but with the success of the first two games in the 80s, a new entry was bound to happen. Came the next generation of Nintendo consoles, the Super Nintendo, and with it, a new challenge arose for Nintendo. Miyamoto knew he wanted to create a new Zelda game, one that went back to the roots of being a top-down adventure game. And without the limitations of the NES, he could finally bring some of those old ideas back to life with Nintendo's new hardware. Not all ideas could make it though, such as the idea of using your lantern on tall grass to spread fire throughout it. This idea though would later be used in titles like Four Sword Adventures and Breath of the Wild. I don't know about you though, but that doesn't really sound like a safe message to spread to children back in the 90s. To be fair, only psychopaths would look at stuff like this and imitate it in real life. And if you know me, I'm no psychopath. Ask my therapist. Trust me. He lost his fucking marbles! But a bunch of ideas still made it in the final game though, and while Nintendo didn't know it at the time, these ideas would become staples in the Zelda series. Things like the Master Sword, hookshot, heart pieces, bottles, locations, and, actual dungeons. With this, on top of many more welcome additions, solidified this game into the hearts of many, and it's still considered one of the best games to many people. And while I can keep on talking about how great this game is, I might as well begin my quest of Lemmy in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Similar to the other games, the game starts off with a quick summary of the game's plot. Once upon a time in the land of Hyrule existed a golden land that many people fought over for. Soon enough, an evil power was plaguing the land, so the king decided to seal the entrance with the 7 wise men and their wicked magic. Years and years later, when everyone thought Hyrule was safe, some loser named Agahim decided to just bust into Hyrule Castle like nothing, kill the king, capture Princess Zelda, and seal away the other 7 descendants of the wise men. Normal villain stuff. So, of course, being the hero of this story, we get a telepathic message from Zelda saying, hey, do this stuff for me, I swear I won't kill your uncle or anything. After that, our uncle leaves for unexplained reasons, and we get on our feet and make our way to Hyrule Castle. Here we see the major graphical improvement the Super Nintendo adds, and it still looks amazing 30 years later. The tone and atmosphere of the first time going to the castle in this thunderstorm is great, and the music behind it just adds this eerie feeling that you know some shit is about to go down. But as long as my uncle ends up fine, I'm sure there's nothing to worry. Zelda, you lying bitch! Well, with my uncle dead and all, I might as well take his sword and shield from his dying hands and continue on the quest. One rescue mission later and a fun trek through the sewers, Zelda is finally safe in the sanctuary. Here, the priest tells you to meet up with the village elder that knows the secret behind killing the wizard, the Master Sword. And to reach him, you have to make your way to Kakariko Village on the west side of the map. Now, finally, the game throws you into the overworld. It's definitely not as carefree as the original Zelda, which allowed the player to go almost any screen they wanted at the start, but it restricts the player in a more helpful way since the map is much bigger. Things like a big boulder blocking your path to Death Mountain, or the caves being surrounded by bodies of water. These little roadblocks usually stick in your brain one way or another, so when you get an item like the Power Glove or Flippers, then you feel this sense of accomplishment when you end up remembering these areas. The game also does a good job on telling the player where to go next, instead of just leaving it up in the air for them to get lost. Dialogue boxes add a lot to helping the player, and while others may see it as an annoying factor that hinders the actual playing of the game, I think it's a welcome addition to the series, and you know me, I love reading words. But even with the game helping out a bunch, I still found myself getting a bit stumped on a few parts, like this part where I had to get this book down from the shelf by dashing into it. It was a very big, oops, that should have been obvious moment. Besides that though, the majority of my playthrough was pretty smooth overall. Some may see it as making the game easier for little babies like me, but I say it makes the game more enjoyable and replayable. Unlike somebody else I know. Let's get back to the actual story. After heading to the village that leads us to this place, we meet up with the village elder, Salsa. Let's just go with that. We meet up with Salsa, who wants to test our strength by retrieving the Pendant of Courage, which is one of 3 that the true hero needs before getting the Master Sword. These pendants are conveniently placed in 3 separate dungeons, with the first one being here, the Eastern Palace. And now I can talk about one of my favorite additions to the game. Good dungeons. Don't get me wrong, the dungeons in the first 2 Zelda games were alright, but the main thing they lacked was any distinctive personality or design. Here, while it's not as perfect as future titles, still make each dungeon memorable in its own way by either its aesthetic or its main mechanic. For example, the first dungeon shows off how these temples are now using the verticality in its design, and while it doesn't have a main mechanic like other dungeons, it still has some memorable rooms, like this one with the cannonballs coming down from the screen. Other dungeons use pretty interesting mechanics as well that keep the game fresh throughout your playtime, like these switch flipping blocks or these on-rail platforms. Or everyone's favorite mechanic, water level management. This place looks like it has too much water in it. Another interesting thing this game adds is to have a specific item for that dungeon that will help with puzzle solving and the dungeon's boss. And these items can range from, oh, that's pretty cool, to, oh, and that's something. Puzzles usually start off pretty simple, but get more complex near the end of the temple. And the boss fights are much better this time around as well. While yes, when you die to the boss, you start at the beginning of the dungeon, the game luckily adds a quick warp point near the boss door from the entrance. And you may need it, because these bosses can be a bit challenging to figure out on your first encounter. But that doesn't mean they're not fun. Some of my personal favorites are here, like the Helmasaur King, Trinex, and of course the final fight against Ganon. That fight specifically was a huge pain, but I still enjoyed slowly learning his patterns and finally destroying him after an hour of trying. One big minus to the dungeons and bosses though is that they play the same music for each palace and encounter, and while it's not a terrible song by any means, it can still take away from the dungeon's aesthetic and personality. But the game makes up for it by adding some iconic songs to the series, like Kakariko Village, the Hyrule Castle theme, and my personal favorite, the Dark World. After getting the 3 pendants Salsa told us about, we make our way to the Lost Woods and retrieve the legendary Master Sword. Now it's time to head back to the sanctuary and oh no. Well, scratch that, time to head back to Hyrule Castle and take care of that pesky wizard bitch. After a fun game of insert tennis joke here, we find ourselves in the Dark World, where now our main goal is to rescue the 7 maidens of the Wise Men and retrieve the Triforce from Ganon. This is a huge turning point for the game, especially for players in the 90s. After getting the Master Sword, the game felt like it was reaching its climax, like the end was near. But little did players know this game was just starting by dropping you off in this whole new connected overworld with not just 2 or 3 more dungeons, but 8. And the fun part is that you could technically start almost any dungeon you wanted here. Well, sorta. Technically, you only have about 3 choices, and then you got 2 more if you decide to beat Thieves Town as soon as possible. It's definitely not as open as its remake/sequel, A Link Between Worlds, but it still gives the player a more freedom-like feeling that the original game shared. With that being said though, what kind of additions does the Dark World bring besides the extra dungeons? Well, of course, a main factor is that it gives a different perspective of the normal locations in the Light World, like how the bustling Kakariko Village is now a desolated Thieves Town, or how the active Death Mountain is now an abandoned wasteland. Another cool thing the Dark World adds is the ability to connect to the Light World by using the Magic Mirror. This mechanic in a way makes exploring more fun and rewarding, especially when you keep track of suspicious areas that most likely connect to its counterpart. And these areas contain some cool secrets and rewards that always seem beneficial, like more heart pieces or rupees to buy more useful items. Hell, one of the most famous secret rooms was created for a winner in a Nintendo-powered contest that's called the Chris Houlihan room, which contains a pile of blue rupees and a sign that states, "My name is Chris Houlihan. This is my top secret room. Keep it between us, okay?" It's so cool to see stuff like this in a game from 1991, and this is just one of the multitude of cool secrets to find in the game. But as much as I can continue talking about the world and its secrets, I think it's finally time to wrap some things up. 7 dungeon montage, go! Seven rescued maidens later, it's time to take care of things in Ganon's tower. Here is the hardest dungeon in the game, but of course that's expected for the final dungeon. They throw you some reused bosses and some interesting puzzles until you reach the boss in Ganon's tower, which is surprisingly not Ganon, it's the wizard man from earlier. So we take care of this wannabe Harry Potter one more time and open up the pyramid in the Dark World where we actually fight the final boss. And you won't guess who it's gonna be! Like I said before, I did have some trouble with this boss fight, but it was still a fun experience figuring out the strategies and tactics. This one is called Son of a Bitch. Now I gotta collect more fairies in this fountain to keep my ass alive and then walk all the way back to the boss and do the stupid shit all over again. But of course, with some patience, Ganon's plans are finally thwarted and we get our hands on the Triforce. And with our courageous and kind heart, we wish for everything to return back to peace. I mean, I wouldn't have wished for that, maybe like another copy of Majora's Mask or something, but it's whatever. With that wish fulfilled, Link's uncle restores his health and the king is now alive, and everything is honky-dory. Until Ganon comes back in the Oracle games according to the timeline. And that is the end to one of the greatest games to many people. A one-of-a-kind classic, a masterpiece in storytelling, a peanut butter to my banana. Now with all the praise I just gave this game, you must think it's one of my favorite games of all time. And really, it's not even close. It's weird because I 100% appreciate everything this game did to its generation and to the Zelda series as a whole. All of the elements it added and how much the series got it right for just its third game, it's crazy to see how well it holds up. But even with all this, I still can't help but say that it barely makes an impact on me. Maybe it's because I played a bunch of other Zelda games before this one, with one of them being A Link Between Worlds. That game improved on a bunch of aspects of this one, and as much as I hate to say it, this game is a much better experience for me than A Link to the Past. But that doesn't mean it's a bad game, because if it was, you wouldn't have heard me praise it for about 10 minutes straight. At the end of the day though, there's no denying that A Link to the Past was a huge step in the right direction for the Zelda series, and it would take yet another huge step 8 years later with the release of Ocarina of Time. But before we get to that classic, we have to take a look into the 4th Zelda game that was released on the Game Boy in 1993. This game being Link's Awakening, Zelda's first big adventure on the handheld, and one that took and gave so many elements that it made the game into its own special, unique journey. Of course, we'll save that for the next time we take a look into the series. For now, I'm just gonna start yelling for no apparent reason. Uncle, you're back!
Lemmy, did you open the box?
Yeah, you took forever, so I thought it'd be best.
Do you know what you just did? Boobies.
Oh shit!